From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm here today to introduce Michael Hiltzik, a Pulitzer Prize-winning LA Times columnist and the author of 6 books. While this session was cataloged under science, Michael is hardly just a science writer. His current LA Times column focuses on business. His Pulitzer, in 1999, was for reporting on corruption in the music industry. He has been a financial and political writer, an investigative reporter, a technology writer and editor, a foreign correspondent in Africa and in Russia. His book topics have included A Murder in Kenya, Xerox PARC, Social Security, the New Deal, and the Hoover Dam. In other words, he's written about pretty much everything. So perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised to come across this gem, written by Michael for the LA Times in 1988. Of course, no one would claim that Trump has ever been weak on self-promotion. Since 1980, he has been New York's most visible and extravagant real estate man, plastering his name over Manhattan Island like the label on a pair of designer jeans. Michael continues, he even maneuvered himself in a brief spot in the national political limelight by journeying up to New Hampshire late last year to give a speech on, of all things, foreign policy. When Michael asked him about that trip and possible presidential aspirations, Trump replies, I went up to New Hampshire and you know what happened? We had the biggest reception of anybody. But Michael concludes in the piece, sometimes his incessant overflow of self-promotion, extravagance, and hyperbole runs a little thin. 1988. Michael's latest book is Big Science, Ernest Lawrence and the Invention that Launched the Military-Industrial Complex. It's partly a biography of Lawrence, who won a Nobel Prize in 1939 for his invention of the cyclotron, and whose lab played a central role in developing the atom and hydrogen bombs. It's also about a shift in science, from a pursuit of individuals with 1 or 2 research assistants to an enterprise involving armies of researchers and billions of dollars. Before we dive into our discussion, I'm supposed to mention that the Library of Congress has been the festival's host for the past 16 years. I want to thank co-chairman David Rubenstein and the many National Book Festival sponsors who made this possible in 2016. You can support the festival with a donation by checking the information in your programs. And there will be questions after the talk. And please note that if you ask a question, it will be recorded for the Library of Congress's records. And now please help me welcome Michael Hiltzik.
Well, thank you, Marissa, for that introduction. I should tell you that I had almost forgotten about that piece I wrote about Donald Trump when I was the New York financial correspondent for the LA Times until somebody tweeted it at me just a few weeks ago, and I went back and I pulled it up and I said, yeah, I did write that. That's right, now I remember. Anyway, thanks to all of you for joining me this afternoon to talk about science and physics and the atom bomb and how that's all tied together in history. And I should also say, give my thanks to the Library of Congress for hosting me here. It's one of the great institutions in Washington and a place where I've researched now 3 books, including this one that we're going to be talking about today. Anyway, I think talking about the origins of big science, that's the capital-intensive, big team, interdisciplinary scientific research that's today's prevailing paradigm of science. I think it's especially appropriate these days because basic scientific research is under political attack today in this country as never before, or at least not since medieval times, in part because it challenges, by its nature, it challenges embedded interests, especially today, the fossil fuel industry. What we tend to see is that scientific revolutions tend to foment economic revolutions, and I think that's really what's behind a lot of the pushback that we're seeing against basic research in Congress. So it behooves us, I think, to go back to the origins of this paradigm of research and draw some lessons from its history for today. So I'm going to start by outlining the background of Ernest Lawrence, the central figure of my book, a man who changed science in ways that still resonate today and will continue to do so well into the future. So who was he? Ernest Orlando Lawrence? Well, the short answer is that during his lifetime, he was the most famous native-born scientist in America. Thank you. In 1937, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine when it was that all-purpose validation of international celebrity during that prehistoric era we think of as the era of print. And here's that cover. You can see it. It's dated November 1st, 1937, over the caption, "He creates and destroys." And that was true. He had created a new particle accelerator, the cyclotron, the most efficient and powerful atom smasher of its time, and he was using it to destroy atomic nuclei as a way to study them. The invention of the cyclotron was only the launch pad for Lawrence's lifelong fame and influence. He would go on to play a crucial role in the development of the atomic bomb and the hydrogen bomb. And we'll be talking a little bit later about how to think about those programs, since we've just passed the 71st anniversaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki just about 6 weeks ago. But Lawrence's overarching legacy was that he created this new paradigm of science that still prevails today. And big science is all around us. High-level research funded by the NIH and the National Science Foundation, which receive nearly $40 billion a year in government appropriations, well, that's big science. NASA's effort to put a man on the moon and to send probes into the farthest reaches of the solar system, that's big science. The Human Genome Project was a $3 billion exercise in big science that launched not only new fields of study, but new industries. Solving climate change will be impossible without big science. The Large Hadron Collider, which discovered that elusive subatomic particle, the Higgs boson, in 2012, well, that's the latest iteration of the first cyclotron that Ernest Lawrence invented more than 8 decades ago. That first cyclotron cost less than $100 in materials, and it fit in the palm of his hand. Its offspring today occupies a tunnel 17 miles in circumference, buried under the French and Swiss countrysides, and it cost $9 billion, and the cost is still rising. In fact, here's an illustration of the cyclotron's genealogy. One of Lawrence's very first devices is there on the left. It's a small container slathered with red sealing wax to keep the vacuum inside that round unit. In the middle is the 37-inch cyclotron, which was one of the first that he built that achieved significant energies. And then on the right, that's the Large Hadron Collider. And for perspective, I think there's a human being in the guts of the Large Hadron Collider, and you can see the difference in scale. And here's one of Lawrence's assistants on the 37-inch in the late 1930s. So that's quite an evolution of a technology over a period of about 80 years. You may not recognize the family resemblance, but it's there. The Large Hadron Collider comprises about 6 advanced cyclotrons and other accelerator technologies. Yet for all that, one central theme of my book is that this paradigm that Lawrence pioneered raises as many questions about humankind's search for knowledge as it answers. One of the most important aspects of big science that we're still grappling with is that it gives scientists and society access to forces of truly destructive power, forces that we found very hard and we hope in the long run not impossible to control. Among the first people to warn of the implications was Lawrence's own colleague on the Manhattan Project, James Franck, a German emigre physicist who 2 months before the first atomic bomb detonated over Japan in August 1945 was observing that the age was already past in which, as he put it, scientists can disclaim responsibility for the use to which mankind has put their discoveries. And the reason, he said, was that what big science had brought about was fraught with infinitely greater dangers than all the inventions of the past put together. And we need to talk not merely about what we do with the knowledge big science brings us, but the resources we spend on that quest. Lawrence's legacy challenges us to think about that, how to weigh the monumental effort it might take to put a man on Mars or discover the next fundamental particle against the imperative to fight cancer or pay for drugs against hepatitis or multiple sclerosis for every sufferer or to end poverty and hunger. So all this, I think, factors into what makes Ernest Lawrence and his work such an intriguing subject for us today. He was a small-town boy born in 1901 in Canton, South Dakota, to a first-generation Norwegian-American family, so it could be said that he grew up with the 20th century. Like many of his friends, he was a tinker, fascinated, in his case, by radio gear, and we could see the qualities that made him a success in later life, even in boyhood. Comfortable with technology and machinery, unassuming, curious, and bored with idleness. Well, those qualities came to fruition in 1929 with the invention that made his reputation. Lawrence had been recruited to join the faculty at Berkeley at a time when physics itself was at a crossroads. The departing generation, scientists like Ernest Rutherford and Marie Curie, had been probing the atomic nucleus with the tools that nature gave them. The emissions of alpha rays from radioactive minerals like radium, husbanded by the thimbleful. With those small science tools, that generation had figured out the structure of the atom, and they had discovered X-rays, radioactivity, and the neutron. But they'd gone about as much as they could with nature's gifts alone. To go further, they recognized, science would need probes of higher energies to delve deeper into the nucleus, and these could only be achieved by applying human ingenuity. It was Rutherford who threw down the challenge for the next generation, calling for an apparatus that could deliver 10 million electron volts, yet, as he said, be safely accommodated in a medium-sized room. While scientists all over the world took up Rutherford's challenge, but what they discovered right off was that if you try to apply or load an apparatus with 10 million volts, what happens is you blow up the apparatus. So they ended up with laboratories filled with shards of glass and metal. Think about trying to fire a mortar shell out of a cannon with a cardboard barrel. Well, one night in Berkeley, Lawrence had a brainstorm. What if you don't apply the voltage to the apparatus, but directly onto the projectile that you're trying to use? If you start with a proton, say, with 100 volts, and give it a 100-volt jolt, now you've got a proton with energy of 200 volts, another jolt, and 300, and so on and so on. But if you do it to a proton traveling in a straight line, say through a linear accelerator, it would have to be more than a mile in length to get to your particle up to the desired energy. So it's not exactly fitting in Rutherford's comfortable room. Well, so now comes the second part of Ernest's brainstorm. He understands that a particle crossing through a magnetic field will follow a curved path. So if he applies a magnetic field to this particle, he can bend his proton into a circle, allowing it to get repeated jolts from just a single electrode and reducing the need to synchronize the electrode's charge. And that's the essence of the cyclotron, reduced to its simplest terms. After enough revolutions, you've got a particle that now carries 1 million volts, 10 million, even 100 million, and all you have to do is aim it at a target and let it rip. The possibilities are limitless, and it all can fit in a medium-sized room, or at least the first cyclotrons could. And here's a schematic of that principle as it appeared in Lawrence's patent application for the accelerator. You can see at the center here, this is where a charged particle is introduced to this vacuum tank. It spirals through the magnetic field, and at each of these gaps, it gets a jolt of energy until it has enough energy to reach the very edge of the tank, where it can be directed through another magnetic field out and toward a target for bombardment. Well, Lawrence knows he's onto something. The very next day, he's seen bounding across the Berkeley campus, buttonholing friends and colleagues and declaring, "I'm going to be famous." And so he was. Over the next decade, Lawrence's team, using the cyclotron to bombard nuclei, discovered scores of new isotopes, including, for example, carbon-14, which we know of for its use in carbon dating and for other biological investigations. Other isotopes became the foundation of the new science of nuclear medicine and the sources of new cures. And there were new elements to be discovered heavier than uranium, which had not been seen in the natural state, like element 94, plutonium. Every discovery made by the cyclotron opened new vistas and raised new questions, which hadn't, and Lawrence responded by designing new cyclotrons, each one bigger and more powerful and more expensive than the last. Big science took shape rapidly. In my book, I quote the physicist Maurice Goldhaber, whose career spanned the transition from small science to big science, and he recalled, as he put it, that the first man to disintegrate a nucleus was Ernest Rutherford, and he could hold the apparatus in his lap. Then he said, "I remember the picture of all the scientists sitting in the cyclotron's lap, and that gives you an idea of the change." And yes, here's Ernest Rutherford in his lab, perhaps not holding his apparatus in his lap, but you can see it all arranged on a rather cluttered laboratory table next to him. And here's that picture of the cyclotron that Goldhaber remembers. 27 scientists of Lawrence's radiation lab at Berkeley sitting inside the magnet of their new 60-inch cyclotron. Remarkably, there are 3 Nobel laureates in this picture. Let's see, there's Louis Alvarez right here. Ed McMillan is over here. I think that's, I've got McMillan, who was not only Lawrence's successor as head of his lab, but also his brother-in-law. And of course, Ernest Lawrence, who's right here in the middle. And one more scientist who perhaps stands as the most accomplished physicist never to get the Nobel Prize, and that's J. Robert Oppenheimer, who is right up here. Well, in 1939, Lawrence won the Nobel Prize for the cyclotron, and what was really notable about the award was that for the first time, the Nobel Committee recognized that the technique of scientific investigation had become equally important as, or perhaps even more important than theory alone. And Lawrence demonstrated not merely inspired scientific technique, but a genius for scientific management. He showed that when you needed to raise millions of dollars to build your apparatus, you had to show the genius of an entrepreneur, a general, a CEO. You had to find ways to raise money from university presidents, foundation boards, industrial executives, and government officials. And for scientists, this was a new religion, and Ernest Lawrence was its prophet. Well, the 1939 Nobels were the last to be awarded until the war clouds over Europe began to dissipate 4 years later. And that brings us, I think, to the central event in Ernest Lawrence's career. The Manhattan Project would validate the big science paradigm. The atomic bomb could never have been invented by a solitary physicist working in his solitary lab using handmade equipment. It required an investment of billions of dollars, armies of scientists and technicians, laboratories built on an industrial scale. The Manhattan Project was the first great big science program, and it proved how powerful an approach this could be when it brought together a large team, in that case, more than 10,000 scientists pursuing a shared goal. Now, many of you no doubt know at least the outlines of the making of the atomic bomb, the effort starting with Albert Einstein's famous letter to Franklin Roosevelt in August 1939, actually the letter written by the physicist Leo Szilard and signed by Albert Einstein. observing that the recent discovery of nuclear fission implied that bombs could be constructed from fissionable uranium, and warning that Nazi Germany might already be working on the problem. The US government swung into action, creating a high-level uranium committee to investigate the possibility, but almost immediately, the effort became bogged down in bureaucracy and inertia. By mid-1941, the two men responsible for marshaling America's scientific manpower and resources for the coming war, Vannevar Bush of the Carnegie Institution and James Conant of Harvard, were on the verge of canceling the uranium bomb project altogether. And their reasons were understandable. Physicists in America hadn't made the case that a bomb could be developed in time to help win the coming war. And if that was so, then every dime spent on a project like that would be a dime wasted because it would be diverted from the effort necessary to win the war. But then it fell to Lawrence himself to interpose his personal reputation in front of the hangman. Convinced that cancellation would be a short-sighted and dangerous step, he demanded a face-to-face meeting with Conant. And for the first time, James Conant heard a physicist of undisputed stature explain not only that the bomb was feasible in the short term, but it was urgent. The opinion of the physics community, Lawrence explained, especially among those who had fled Germany and Austria and come to the US and the UK, was that the scientists who had stayed behind in the Third Reich, people like Werner Heisenberg, were intellectually more than capable of designing a fission bomb themselves. And as Lawrence told Conant, if the Nazis succeed first, they will have in their hands the control of the world. Well, Conant listened and he was sort of convinced, but one thing still bothered him. If all you scientists are so sure that a bomb is feasible and necessary, he said, how come none of you has volunteered to step ahead and take over the building of it? Ernest, he said, are you ready to devote the next years of your life for getting these bombs made? Well, Lawrence sort of swallowed hard and he said, well, Jim, if you tell me this is my job, I will do it. And that right there, that saved the atomic bomb program at what may be the single most important meeting of the nuclear age. With Ernest Lawrence's reputation behind it and his personal commitment, what was soon dubbed the Manhattan Project would never again be in doubt. Now, I want to show you one more photograph, a very famous historical artifact. This picture was taken in Lawrence's office in LeConte Hall in 1940 at Berkeley, and it shows the brain trust of American science just before the war. From the left, there's Lawrence, and then next to him, Arthur Holly Compton, another Nobel laureate and the future chancellor of Washington University in St. Louis. Vannevar Bush is next to him. There in front is Conant. Just behind him is Carl Compton, Arthur's brother and then the president of MIT. And there over on the right, a mysterious figure named Alfred Loomis, who had used the millions he had made as a Wall Street trader to build a private physics lab at his estate in Tuxedo Park, New York, from which he cultivated and funded many distinguished young physicists, including Lawrence, and who was functioning as a key behind-the-scenes advisor to Bush and Conant during the war. Now, these gentlemen had come to Berkeley as a delegation from the Rockefeller Foundation because Lawrence had sought a huge grant from the foundation to build his biggest cyclotron yet, and he got it. $1.15 million, one of the largest grants the foundation had ever made to a single researcher. But what's especially remarkable and important about this photograph is that this exact group would come together a year later to act as the scientific supervisors of the Manhattan Project. Well, over the following 4 years, Lawrence would play a paramount role in that program. He converted his new cyclotron into an invention to enrich natural uranium to bomb grade by concentrating its fissionable isotope, U-235. He designed and supervised the construction of the industrial plant to manufacture the enriched product in a rural district in Tennessee known as Oak Ridge. That plant would produce every atom of the uranium for the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. He gave one of his young associates, the chemist Glenn Seaborg, priority time on his other cyclotrons at Berkeley to pursue the isolation of plutonium, which would become the core of the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. And when General Leslie Groves, the head of the project, came around looking for someone to head up the actual designing of the bomb at the lab that became Los Alamos, Lawrence nominated his close friend and Berkeley colleague, Robert Oppenheimer, and got him the job. Now, all that being said, what about the moral implications of this work? Not only Lawrence's role, but big science's role in the war. And you know, the study of history is an exercise in looking at events through the eyes of the people who live them, but also applying the perspective of the years or the decades. This exercise is especially complicated with nuclear weapons because we're so familiar with the consequences of this work. We know the toll in lives and suffering from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We know of the horrific disfigurements and long-term illnesses of the civilian residents of those cities, unlike anything experienced by any other survivors of warfare in history. We know the cloud that civilization has lived under for 70 years because of the decision in the 1940s to unleash the destructive capacity of the nucleus. And we know that the Nazis never actually did have an atomic bomb program because the scientists who stayed behind got the physics wrong and concluded it could never be built. But of course, the Allies didn't know that until the war was over. Now, Germany's surrender in 1945 changed the calculus of this work, but not the momentum of the effort. But by then, the bombs were nearly complete. The impulse to use them was still strong to bring a quick end to the war. And the final debate among scientists and political leaders before Hiroshima was over whether dropping the bombs on the unsuspecting Japanese was truly necessary, or whether a demonstration, say over an unpopulated island, would deliver a sufficiently compelling and grim message to the Japanese regime. The record tells us that the last holdout against dropping the bombs on civilians was Lawrence himself, but that eventually he too acknowledged that the risk of a dud, and thus a demonstration that wouldn't work, was too great, and he and Oppenheimer together signed the manifesto that was sent to Washington endorsing the dropping of the bomb. Now, many of the big scientists who developed the atom bomb, including Oppenheimer, would soon reconsider their role. Many would work to promote the cause of international control over nuclear technology, recognizing that what big science had unleashed could be managed safely only through a new conception of geopolitics and diplomacy. Many others would work to develop nuclear power and other peaceful technologies, perhaps in the hopes of expiating the moral qualms that Hiroshima and Nagasaki had brought them to. Well, Ernest Lawrence was not among them. Introspection was not his strong suit, and when his old friend Robert Oppenheimer declared that through the atomic bomb, physicists had come to know sin, he responded rather petulantly that nothing about his work had caused him to know sin. And that was still true after the war, when he became the nation's leading scientific promoter of the hydrogen bomb, a weapon that many of his own colleagues viewed as nothing but a genocidal device, and that even the Pentagon acknowledged could never be used in a military campaign, but only as a psychological threat. But because Ernest died in 1958, we don't know what he would have made of the nuclear world big science helped create. His widow, Molly, thought he would have been aghast at nuclear proliferation. In the late 1980s, in fact, she was so appalled at the role in the arms race played by Lawrence's own lab that she petitioned Congress to take her husband's name off the facility. Well, Congress turned her down, and to this day it's known as the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. But what we can say, I think, is that science itself can't be seen as good or evil. We can only render judgment on what humankind makes of it. Ernest Lawrence's new paradigm of scientific research has given us knowledge about the natural world that his own contemporaries could only dream of. It's given us isotopes and diagnostic techniques that save lives. It put men on the moon. It's given us new knowledge about our own biology. It provides us with ways to battle disease, and it may provide us with weapons against climate change, even as it's given us the tools to destroy ourselves too. And now I'd like to leave you with one last topic to think about, and that's whether after 70 or 80 years, we may have reached the political and economic limits of big science. The reason that the Large Hadron Collider is the biggest accelerator in the world is that the United States abandoned its own parallel project, the superconducting super collider, in the 1990s, mostly because its budget had grown so huge, but also because the scientific community itself was not united behind it. Almost since the beginning, the cost of big science has prompted its critics to ask whether it can get too expensive, whether it leads us to value monumental scientific efforts more than programs that might have a direct relevance to our daily lives, like ending poverty or hunger. Big science has helped make our universities great, but it's also helped turn our professors into administrators, housekeepers, and publicists, all for the cause of raising more money to make science even bigger. And part of that, I think, is the political fear it inspires, because some politicians, including many in Congress today, recognize that left alone, big science can yield discoveries that change the world, and that, of course, is always a threat to entrenched interests. Now, that said, one thing I think we can be confident about is that the human thirst for knowledge is never quenched. That if we want an illustration of that, just consider the excitement felt a year ago, not only among astronomers and cosmologists, but among the general public, about the extraordinary photos of Pluto that came from the New Horizons spacecraft after a 9-year voyage to the absolute limits of our solar system. Findings that are already changing scientists' understanding of the life arc of planets. So yes, Lawrence's genius gave us new access to knowledge, but as is true with almost everything, that gain came at a cost. He helped us to learn a lot, but he also gave us a lot more to think about. And with that, with this image of Lawrence himself overlooking the lab that he built in a ravine above the Berkeley campus, I'll thank you for listening and throw open the floor for questions. Okay, and I gather if you want to ask a question, we have microphones up here at the front in both aisles. So, let it rip.
Shall I start? After the war, Heisenberg somewhat controversially claimed that he had deliberately made a mistake in the payload needed for the weapon in order to slow down a German atomic bomb project that he didn't want Hitler to have. Obviously, there's a self-serving aspect to that. Do you think there's any merit to it as well?
Well, I'm not actually sure that Heisenberg made that claim or that it was made on his behalf. But it's clear if you're familiar with the so-called farm hall transcripts. Farm hall was a farmhouse in the UK where the German physicists, that is those who had stayed behind, were rounded up after the war by the Allies, and they were shipped to this farm and put together, and they were allowed to communicate with each other and meet and socialize, and every word they uttered was bugged. And it was clear from those conversations, and it's clear from those transcripts, that these scientists were absolutely flabbergasted when the word came over that the bomb existed and was dropped. They were not prepared for this having happened. It really looks from the transcripts that they had a lot of disagreements, and they were blaming each other for who made the mistakes that led to their failure. But it really does look like it was not so much a deliberate mistake as a misconception about the essential physics of atomic bombs. So, yeah, I think Heisenberg or his patrons wanted to make a hero out of him or make him look more heroic. But I think there's reason to doubt that story.
Thank you.
Okay, you said that before the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, there was a debate among the physicists about whether the bomb should be dropped as a demonstration on an unpopulated island, and the fear was that they might drop a dud. Why was it that there was no concern about them dropping a dud on Hiroshima?
Well, I think if you're dropping, I think the idea was that a dud was going to be bad if it failed to shorten the war in a demonstration. But if you're dropping the bomb in warfare, you're basically in for a penny, in for a pound. There was concern that it would be a dud if just to go into a little bit more detail than you may be asking for. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was a one-off bomb. It was a simple bomb because of the qualities of uranium. They didn't really think it was going to be a dud, but they never tested it because the engineers who built it thought it was basically a trivial engineering device. It was the plutonium bomb that was tested at Trinity because that was a new technology nobody was sure would work. But I think the idea was they didn't really think it would be a dud, but the consequences of a fizzle they thought would be much worse than if the goal was to shock the Japanese regime into ending the war. Then since they only had the one uranium bomb, they needed to use it in a way that it might work.
Hi, I have two parts to my question. One, doing when the atomic bomb was made, we were really worried about Germany making the atomic bomb, but why did we not worry about Japan making the atomic bomb? And my other part is, if we swapped the atomic bomb in Germany, could we prevented the Cold War?
Well, the question is, if we were worried about Germany making the bomb, why were we not equivalently worried about Japan? Is that the question? Yes. I think the conception of Japanese as enemies was quite a bit different from the conception of Germany, in part because we had so many scientists and other people, other figures here in the US and in the UK who had direct experience with the Nazi regime, and they saw it as uniquely fearsome. I don't think there was quite as much concern that Japan was bent on world domination. There was certainly concern that it was bent on regional domination, and there was not as much of a fear that Japan had the understanding or the technology that was resident over in Germany still, even after all these physicists had left. So there was a very different attitude. I don't think the Japanese were nearly as feared in terms of their ambitions as the Germans.
I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about the current state of funding for science. I've read that there's less money for basic science and more aimed at science that can assist corporate products, corporate technology, industrial technology.
Sure. I think there's good reason to be concerned at what's happened to scientific funding, especially in the US over recent years, really recent decades. The government, which had become a major patron of basic scientific research after the war and well into the post-war period, has been withdrawing, essentially. It's been stepping back from this sort of funding, in part because of political pressure, but also because of budgetary concerns, essentially conservative budget making. Now, I think that's got two effects that scientists and we all really should be concerned about. One is that basic science is facing, in many ways, a starvation budget. And that should be a concern because this is our seed corn, after all. You don't get applied science, you don't get advanced technology until you start with basic science and you pursue it in a way that follows its own logic. You can't direct basic science to happen within a time frame. You can't direct basic science to a specific goal. You have to let it go where it leads you. Now, as the government has stepped back, its role has been taken over more and more by industry. In some ways that's good because industry has a lot of money, but in many ways it's bad because industry is simply not inclined to invest in basic science because it can't see an immediate payoff. And that's understandable, but that's why we have government funding of projects like this. Now, in my previous books I've written about the birth of the internet and the construction of Hoover Dam. These were all projects that were undertaken in their earliest stages by government agencies because private industry couldn't see an immediate payoff or a direct payoff for itself, so it wouldn't pursue this work on its own. And that's what we're going to see as industry takes on the funding of scientific research more and more. It's going to become more interdirected. It's going to become more directed at the core business lines of those industries, and we're going to give up, we're going to lose a lot of research opportunities that we would have if we really were still supporting basic research, not only to the degree we have in the past, but to an even greater degree. So as I said, I think we should all be very concerned about this trend. We should be concerned about the political attack on basic science and the misunderstanding and maybe deliberate misunderstanding that we get on Capitol Hill about the value of this work. You know, we should hope that we can reverse that trend. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. My question is, you know, very short and simple, but then I'll give some background and whatever I can remember, just so that I'm sure, you know, this country is so great, and so is the science community. But in between, I see a lot of dragging around and, you know, a lot of unnecessary suffering that people are going through, especially decent people like myself. So for that purpose, do you think the science community or the scientists and the, you know, because they work on the true facts, not about writing about imaginary things, Shakespeare and this and that. So are they empowered? I bet they are, but just to educate the masses. Are they the president of the United States or the president of the world, or, you know, that kind of council? Is it still being worked? Have they already reached that status, or it's a struggle between the other groups, for example, Navy, Army, you know, Air Force, this and that? So the reason I'm saying that is some are, I think, betting on the power of Noah's Ark, or kind of, and which is kind of makes sense when the things keep on, you know, if the parents are very nice, the children are from, you know, different kind of world or whatever, and then we squabble for food crumbs and things like that. It gets so nasty that the others will think, oh, we got our Noah's Ark, so, you know, we got our thing, and let them do whatever they like. I feel like that sort of thing is going on a rampant scale. So, for example, in Japan and the Germany thing, I know there's, I bet they have finished or accomplished a lot of closure in terms of how their family died and this and that.
Well,
but in terms of, like, for example, the Germans or the Japanese, I think they are the most beautiful people, you know? And now that many generations have passed down, are they able to differentiate? For example, instead of attacking the all good Germans or the all good Japanese or the good Americans or the good Saudis or whatever, rather than saying that, oh, these are, you know, basically this, but they look similar, but it's because they are Turkish or they are Iranians, and then they are hybrids and this and that, and then some when they get the equal power.
Well,
and
all right,
okay, so
I think
so my goal is to minimize the hurts and the things that that don't need to go through. When we have all this beautiful heaven land, I should say, at this rate, I think nobody should be suffering and arguing and feeling afraid about, if I say this word, my bike would be stolen when I get out of the convention hall. Okay, sir. So in other words, how much power science community, the scientists have?
Let me just try to, you know, I think what you're getting at is sort of a permanent tension among all of these sort of groups and factors in science and politics, and I don't think we're ever going to be able to get away from that, but we really just have to work our way through it. And let me take another question on this side.
Do you have a question, young man? He wanted to know, Michael, what can you tell us about your next project?
Well, my next project is a departure. It's going to be a book about the Gilded Age, the original Gilded Age of the 1890s, and the consequences for America of the creation of the great railroads as the first great American big business. So it's a departure from this book, though not necessarily from my previous book. And I think there's another question here.
Yeah,
and this may be the last one we have time for. Yeah.
So this goes back to the comments you were making about funding. I'm curious, you're talking about a little bit of an evolution from garage scientists to the big science. and now we live in this YouTube age, blog celebrities, Kickstarter. How is that affecting, ground level innovation, especially in the sciences, or how could it in the future?
Well, that's a good question. You're right. There is a trend, of course, towards sort of the entrepreneurial scientist and funding that comes in new ways. I think there's also reason to be concerned about sort of the I guess the commercialization of early stage science that we're seeing in places like Silicon Valley and elsewhere. We certainly have seen cases where scientists working on basic science at publicly funded institutions end up sort of hiding their work from colleagues because they can see some commercial potential in it. Lawrence himself was very skeptical about patenting even, and this was a skepticism that was much more common in his day than it is now. He resisted patenting the cyclotron originally, but he himself had patrons who said, look, you have to protect your invention from commercial exploitation that you can't control. So they insisted that he file a patent, and he did reluctantly. He didn't like the process. He didn't like having to explain his work to patent examiners who couldn't understand it. Later in his career, he was under pressure to patent the isotopes that were coming out of his lab. He resisted that, and he won that battle. In part, he won it by default because the patent examiners of the day couldn't be convinced that the creation of isotopes, which were natural materials, could actually be, that this could be patentable inventions. But he didn't like the idea. He didn't like it originally. He didn't like the incursion of that sort of commercialism and politics into his lab. But I think this was a tide that he tried to hide back and wasn't all that successful in doing. So I think that's it. If you have more questions, I'm right here, and feel free to come up and say hello.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.